Good evening, everyone, and good evening particularly to scholars today who are receiving awards. There is nothing more empowering for a person of my age to see young women moving up, changing their lives, and in the process looking ahead to changing our society. And I hope that's the path all of you are going to choose. Now, an article marking the 30th anniversary of Ruth First's murder described her as an incisive writer, a Democrat in an undemocratic times, a white woman when to be white meant to be loyal to apartheid, when to be a woman was to be submissive and to maleness. But she was none of these. Instead, Ruth First used her life to grapple with questions of power and was killed by a letter bomb. Today, I would like us to talk a bit about how women address power. Because we live in a world where power is defined in different ways, and how we react to it is different from society to society, individual to individual. Ruth was not only a pioneer in the field of literature, but unlike most South Africans, she looked beyond our borders. Much of the population here tended to think of what was described as South Africa as a bit of Europe. And Ruth's writings expanded far beyond that. If you look at it, she wrote a lot about mine workers, yes, but then she crossed the borders, Southwest Africa, Uganda, Libya, and so on. So her writing and her vision scanned the continent of Africa. What made her consider this? Because I think Ruth's vision was something that saw rights, peace, security as indivisible, as something that had to belong together, that you couldn't have something that was equal down here and totally unequal there, that people came together in a particular life, not divided by borders. And now, 30 years later, I think the world is moving into that kind of notion, a notion of security, which is a common security. For much of the 20th century, and certainly during Ruth's lifetime, security was about the security of the state, of the frontiers and its leaders, and no more so than in South Africa. Hence, we had the great wars, the destruction of cities, the carnage and massacres of men, women, and children, regardless of who proclaimed victory. But the question is, were people more secure under that regime, under that concept of security? Now, with the new millennium, there has been a shift, an attempt to reconceptualize security in terms of a people-centered security and a global challenge to advance peace and security, development and human rights as an integrated solution to respond to the full range of the critical and pervasive threats that face people today. And the question we have to ask ourselves, are we doing this? Or are we still focusing on individual threats to something called security? Or are we integrating them? Are we seeing my security dependent on yours and yours and yours? Are you seeing your security dependent on everyone else? So that we have a common notion, a common perspective of security as a global concept and something that we have to reach. So what would Ruth be saying to us today? It's interesting that the census results came out earlier this morning. But what would she be saying to us? I'm sure she would, to some extent at least, join in the celebration of our Constitution and democracy. She would also be holding up a mirror, showing how far we have yet to go. We still live, according to the census, in segregated areas, divided not by laws, but by wealth. From this flows our separate schools, hospitals, provision of water and electricity. Far from removing the gaps between us, the divide between the haves and the have-nots is growing wider. And Ruth would be facing each one of us and saying, why? What are you doing about it? Most distressing is why we as a people do not feel it necessary to address these issues, but call on them being a government, a council, someone else, to address these issues. How many of us as citizens get involved in trying to address and ameliorate these kinds of divisions that exist in our society? Even as we meet today, there is an inquiry into the events at Marikana, where over 40 striking miners were killed. What is the policy of this democratic elected government that guides police and permits them to use live ammunition against crowds of striking workers? I have not seen that question being addressed or asked. There must be a policy somewhere, but what is that policy? I know in the struggle against apartheid, we used to fight to get that policy cleared, because there were many such incidents when children were killed, when strikers, when workers in demonstration, people were killed. But because of the inquiry still going on, perhaps I should not go further. But as citizens, we need to ask why, when migrant labor was abolished, and it has been abolished, we did not require the mining houses to build proper housing for children, for workers. We have all seen on television that what has happened is, as the mines have closed down, or as mining communities move out of rural areas and come to join as family units, they are setting up shanty towns. There is no housing for them. Once the hostels go, what happens? You still have those communities living in shacks without any kind of facilities. Now, why is that? And I think these are the questions we need to really address. Now, we are proud of our gender-sensitive constitution, but there are dark clouds on the horizon, and I want to alert women in particular to that. New legislation will place African women under the power of traditional leaders. We're back to where we were 30, 40 years ago. Violence against women appears to be growing. There was a surge of women leaders in government in the ANC, but the numbers, if you look at them, are declining. It's not increasing. Why is this? Now, the ANC, through its history, stood for values of honesty, personal sacrifice, service to the people and to the country. Can we honestly say that these values now prevail in the organization and that we proclaim them in this South Africa? Or are we scrambling for access to power, which leads to personal entrenchment? Regrettably, that point is at the heart of our problems. We have lost our value systems. We have lost the values for which so many people died and so much struggle was encompassed. And unless we pull ourselves up, establish a new value system, or find a way of recouping the old one and living by those values, we are going to undo the achievements that we have made so far, undo the achievements of the last century, undo our democratic constitution. And so I'm torn between despair, but still a hope that the South African people will always come out of whatever conditions are imposed on them, and move to change society. That is something that we have done through our history, and I hope we have not lost the capacity to do that. And I wish that we can continue. And in particular, it is something that is a challenge to the new generation, to all of you young people, to follow the examples of the past, meet the challenges that we face, reintroduce the values that your parents, your grandparents, that all of our families had, so that we can move together to that better future that was promised to all of us. Thank you all very much. I wish you all the best.